welcome everyone to We Are Triathletes webinar series, and it is my pleasure. I am so excited. I love Matt Fitzgerald. He is amazing, and I'm so happy and excited that he's with us today. And without further ado, you know he writes a ton of books that are incredible. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Matt. And let me just see, I'm going to unpin myself.
All right, well, thank you all for joining in. This is going to be a very nuts and bolts training talk here, so hopefully everyone listening will get something useful out of it. I've tweaked the title since we first agreed on it, Hillary. It's now called, as you see, How the Pros Train, subtitled, and Why You Should and Can. Whoops, there's a grammatical error in there. Should be trained like them. Oh my goodness, the writer. So embarrassed. But yeah, this is sort of my shtick, you know, as a endurance coach and nutritionist, actually as well. I'm of the philosophy that by and large, the top performing athletes actually know what they're doing, and that we should emulate their quote unquote best practices. So, I mean, you have to take that with a grain of salt, obviously. You know, we can't necessarily do exactly what the pros do if we don't have all the talent they have or all the time they have. But as a general principle, I believe in paying attention to what the top athletes do, and trying to emulate the key methods that they use to achieve success. So that's what this talk will be all about on the triathlon training side. So all credit really goes to this guy here for the material. This gentleman is named Stephen Seiler. He's an exercise physiologist who, he's American, but he actually lives and works in Norway. He married a Norwegian woman, and he speaks the language. He's based out of a university there, and he's an athlete himself. And so early in his career, he was intrigued by a very simple question, which I put on the screen here. How do the best endurance athletes in the world really train? You know, we have some ideas, you know, because they're out there and we can observe them, but he wanted to sort of quantify how they train and look for common patterns, because if there are certain things that the most successful athletes are doing, not just in one discipline like running, but also in swimming, cross-country skiing, rowing, triathlon, cycling, if they're doing it all over the world, then there's a lot of reason to believe that they're doing those things because they actually work. And so he's done a ton of research in this area, just trying to figure out how the pros train. But also, you know, the second question is, I mean, that's a very interesting question in itself, but there's also another one that immediately follows on that. Okay, if the pros are all basically doing the same thing, what if, you know, does that necessarily mean that it also works best for everyday athletes like us? That's what we really care about. I mean, it's interesting to see what the pros do, but as athletes ourselves, we really want to know, you know, can we emulate what they do and get similar results? So here is a graphic that sort of kind of encapsulates the answer to that question, like what are the pros, what are the top athletes actually doing? He calls it, so that, again, this guy's name is Stephen Seiler, and he calls this Seiler's hierarchy of endurance training needs. And the idea is the base of the pyramid, so there are 8 levels of this pyramid, and each level represents a specific training methodology or practice. And basically these are the 8 key methods that are proven to be, so there's sort of things that you have to do if you want to optimize your endurance performance through training. And he ordered them in the order of bang for the buck, basically. So the base of the pyramid represents that, that first level. Basically, the way I look at it is this: if you're only going to do one thing right in your training, it should be the first level of the pyramid. If you're already doing that, then the next thing, if you're only going to do one other thing right with your training, it should be the next level up in the pyramid. So all of these things matter, but he arranged them in order of like what matters the most, what's going to have the biggest impact, positive impact on your training if you get it right. So he's a scientist, and if you look on the right side of the screen, he talks about the strength of evidence, because that matters a lot too. It's like, okay, what is this actually based on? So some of it is based on actual controlled studies conducted by scientists, and some of it is also based on what are known as observational studies, where scientists just go into the field and look at or measure what top performing athletes are actually doing. And both of those are important. Controlled studies are great, but they have their limitations. And larger observational studies are great, but they also have limitations. And I'll drill down on that a little bit as we go along. So we're just going to go through these 8 things one by one. And they add up to how the pros train and how you should also train. Though when I say that, I mean, you should train like a pro scaled to your level. That's key. Just like, eating like the pros doesn't necessarily mean eating 5,000 calories a day like they do. You can emulate how they eat without eating as much as they do. So the base of the pyramid, like the idea is that if you're only going to do one thing right with your training, it should be the base layer of the pyramid, as Seiler phrases it, is total frequency / volume of training. The way I sort of paraphrase that is the rule, turn that into a rule, is train a lot. If there's only one thing you're going to do right as an endurance athlete, it's to spend a lot of time training. What's interesting about that, I talked about like strength of evidence a minute ago. You can see I put on this slide 2 facts. The first fact is that there's virtually 0 evidence from controlled scientific research that high volume training is optimal for endurance fitness building. The second fact is high volume training is optimal for endurance fitness building. Well, how can that be? See, this is why I said controlled studies have limitations, because it's actually almost impossible to design a controlled study that will prove that training a lot is beneficial. Because the way you have to do it is you have to take couch potatoes. You have to take people who are currently not training, and you got to get a bunch of them, and then you have to separate them into 2 groups. And then one group has to not train a lot, maybe try like a high intensity, low volume approach. And the other group has to train a lot. The trouble is, a couch potato can't safely train a lot, right? Like on your first day of exercise, if you haven't been exercising, you can't go out and run 20 miles. So in order to do a study like this correctly, in a way that gives high volume training a fair chance to prove whether it's beneficial or not, you would have to have these subjects follow a prescribed, sensible buildup in their training volume, not just for weeks, not just for months, but for years. It takes years to get to the level where your body can actually handle the maximum amount of training that genetically, you're capable of handling. And that, no matter who you are, it takes a long, long time. That's just not a feasible study to be done. So it hasn't been done. So we know it's just established beyond any doubt that if you want to win an Olympic medal in triathlon or running or cycling, you have to put in a ton of training time. Like no athlete with elite level talent in the right mind would try to get to the Olympics by working out 30 minutes a day. So the proof for this really all comes from real world evidence. It does not come from controlled scientific studies. And yet we really can be absolutely sure that nothing gives you more bang for your buck than an endurance athlete and training a lot. Now, if we're going to pivot toward everyday athletes, it's funny that this is the base of the pyramid. This is the one thing you really should do, because it's actually of all 8 layers in the pyramid, it's the hardest one for everyday athletes to emulate, because we're busy. we don't have all day to train. So most of the way to follow the elite's example with regard to this base level of the pyramid is not to train as much as they do, but to train as much as you can reasonably within your lifestyle constraints. and also within, you know, your personal preferences. You know, most endurance athletes, you know, everyday folks like us, we could train more than we choose to, but our livelihood does not depend on our race results, right? So we're only gonna sacrifice so much family time for training, and that's fine, you know. That's, each of us has to make that decision for ourselves. But it's simply good to know that there's nothing that will have a greater impact on your training than just getting out there and putting in time. Now, I have to qualify that in a future slide, but we'll just leave that out there for now. So the next level, I apologize for this graphic here, I just grabbed it off the internet, but so the next most important thing, the next most impactful thing that you can do in endurance training is to include high intensity in your training. So yes, you need to train a lot, but some of that training, if you want to get the most out of your training time, has to be done at high intensity. And there is, you know, talk about the two different types of proof, real world versus controlled studies. There's a ton of proof from controlled studies that high intensity training offers a huge bang for the buck. I'm going to pause for a sip from a rather noisy water bottle I have here. So it's crucial to not just, you know, be out there turning the cranks on your bike and churning out laps and what have you, but also to be pushing really hard in a portion of that time. What's interesting is that most endurance athletes, most everyday athletes are much more willing to put in time than they are to really suffer. You know, most of us have, like, psychologically, I see this as a coach, we like that slow burn type of discomfort where you go out at a comfortable pace and you feel fine. And then after a couple hours, you start to feel a little bit miserable. But high intensity interval training is uncomfortable right out of the gate. And so there's a kind of natural aversion to that type of training. And therefore, a lot of athletes simply don't do enough of it. So it represents a huge opportunity to improve. And it is an acquired taste. You know, you can actually learn to sort of embrace the suffering that you experience in a good high intensity interval session. So this one sort of circles back on the first two. So the third layer of the pyramid is training intensity distribution. And, you know, I should say this is sort of where it all started with Steven Seiler, the guy whose research I'm basing this entire presentation on. That's the very first thing that Seiler looked at, was this training intensity distribution in elite endurance athletes all over the world. And the thing that he found, sort of the big aha discovery he made, was that you know, cyclists, runners, swimmers, triathletes, rowers, and cross-country skiers all over the world at the very highest level of these sports, the true elites, were spending about 80% of their time, of their total training time, at low intensity and 20% at high intensity. It was just really striking that this pattern was so universal. So this led to him to conclude that this has to be optimal, because top athletes in these sports did not always train this way. He did this as well. He looked at top endurance athletes from generations past, and they tried all kinds of different types of things from all low intensity to all high intensity and everything in between. And sort of this convergence occurred over the decades where everyone sort of ended up doing this. And guess what also happened at the same time? Performance standards went up and up and up. So that's pretty powerful real world evidence that an 80-20 distribution of training intensity is crucial for actually getting the most out of the time you invest in your training. Now, Steven Seiler puts this at level 3 on his pyramid. So it's like the third most important thing to get right. Personally, I actually consider it the very first thing that you should get right. Now, remember, the bottom of the pyramid is training a lot. The trouble is, training a lot is a waste of time unless you've got your intensity balance right. So it so happens that although virtually all elite endurance athletes are doing 80% of their training at low intensity and 20% at moderate to high intensity. Almost everyone else, the everyday folks like us, are caught in what I refer to as the moderate intensity rut. So we're doing more like a 50-50 thing. We're spending about half of our training time at moderate intensity and actually not enough at low intensity, and also not very much at a true high intensity at all. We're in no man's land with our intensity. So we're not doing what the pros do. And there've been studies done to show that even athletes with sort of average talent who only train for 45 minutes or an hour a day, so not pros, even athletes at that level improve more when they distribute their training intensity like the elites, 80-20, get out of that moderate intensity rut and start doing the 80-20 thing. So it's a huge opportunity to improve. Like you don't even have to train more. Say you currently train 8 hours a week. You could take those same hours and go from a 50-50 intensity distribution to an 80-20 intensity distribution and get a lot fitter without investing a single minute more in your training. But the other thing you'll find if you go from 50-50 to 80-20 is that you're actually training easier overall because you're spending more time at low intensity. So once you've made that switch, you actually feel like you could do more. And a lot of athletes choose to do that. So that's why in my own coaching, I always make this the first step, correcting intensity balance, because almost everybody who comes to me is initially doing it wrong, and they're going to improve if they get it right. And then we can, because it's a waste of time to start training more if you're stuck in the moderate intensity ruts, and who wants to waste their time? So all this to say, even though this is level 3 of the pyramid, I think it's actually the first step you should take. Get your training intensity balance right, then start looking at possibly training more if you feel like it. And you probably will feel like it once you're doing the 80-20 thing. So level 4 of the pyramid is what Steven Seiler labels general periodization details. And periodization is just a fancy term that refers to how different types of training are sequenced over the course of a training cycle. So, what's interesting about all these training methods is that every single one of them was discovered at some point. Like, there's none of them that athletes were always doing. So, nowadays, it's just common sense that you shouldn't be training the same way 12 weeks out from your race that you are 3 weeks out from your race, right? We all sort of know that. Well, athletes, even Olympic athletes, didn't always know that. Like, they just sort of initially had a get fit, stay fit mentality where they did the same thing all the time. And we now know, as level 4 of the pyramid demonstrates that it makes a big difference, specifically how you sequence different types of training. And so the graphic on the right here is sort of a standard periodization approach. It originated with a guy named Arthur Lydiard, who's legendary. He's known as one of the greatest running coaches of all time. He was a New Zealander, had his heyday in the late 50s, early 60s. He really put New Zealand on the map in running. This tiny little island nation produced a ton of great runners because Arthur Lydiard was the first one. Well, he was doing very much an 80-20 thing all the way back in the 50s with his athletes. But he came up with this approach to periodization, where you start with several weeks of just gentle, easy training, building up your volume, and then transitioning into a kind of a strength phase with a lot of hill work, and then transitioning into a lot of intervals and stuff. So one phase following another. A lot of time has passed since then, and different ways of periodization have been tried and tested. And it's actually, what's interesting, what we're seeing now is that, that expression, there's more than one way to skin a cat. It really does apply to periodization in endurance training. there have been some cool studies coming out within the past couple of years showing that you can actually have one group of athletes sequence their training in one way, and another group of athletes sequence their training in almost the opposite way, and yet they both get the same results. As long as they're obeying, as long as everything they're doing overall is is sensible and obeys kind of the rules of this pyramid as a whole, there's more than one way you can sequence your training types and get fitter. So that might leave you kind of confused. It's like, well, if anything goes, what should I do? The way I look at it is that there are two rules that you must obey in periodization. Two rules you can't break in terms of like giving your training a direction. One is like your workload has to increase over time. Like there's no, other than like correcting your intensity balance, like once you're doing the 80-20 thing, there's only one way left to get fitter, and that's to increase your workload. You can increase your workload either by training more or by doing training more intensely. So over time, you know, your workload has to increase. And so there's various ways you can track your training just to make sure that that's the case. I don't know if we have any Training Peaks users listening, but they have their performance management chart, which, you know, you input all your workout data and it crunches the numbers. It factors the volume and the intensity together because they both matter. They both contribute to workload. And it just shows you whether in fact you trained harder this week than you did last week and the week before and so on. So that's one of a few ways that you can just see, is my training going in the right direction? Because again, there's no other way to get fitter once you're doing the 80-20 thing than to increase your workload. The other rule that you absolutely should follow in periodizing your training or giving it the appropriate direction is making it more and more specific to the demands of whatever race you're preparing for. So, because you could have 2 different weeks of training that have the same workload, but the specific workouts are actually very different in one week versus the other week. And so if you're training for, you know, a sprint triathlon versus an iron distance triathlon, you know, those are very different races, right? One's much shorter, more intense, and the other's much longer and less intense. So the idea is that when you're getting closer and closer to a sprint triathlon, your toughest workouts should be close to the intensity that you're going to be swimming, cycling, and running in that sprint triathlon, which is very intense. If you're training for an Ironman, the closer you get to race day, Ironman race day, the more your toughest workouts should look like an Ironman. So obviously, whereas if you're training for a sprint, the last few weeks of training before you taper should emphasize high intensity intervals and tempo stuff. When you get closer to an Ironman, your toughest sessions should actually just be long endurance sessions and what are known as kind of steady state workouts, which are, you know, prolonged efforts at kind of a moderate intensity. So those are the 2 golden rules. Like, yes, there's more than one way to skin a cat with periodization, but there are 2 rules you have to obey, sort of guardrails to make sure that your training is going in an appropriate direction. One is workload has to increase over time. 2 is your training should go sort of from general to specific with respect to whichever race is most important coming up for you. Another sip of water here. All right, layer number 5 of the pyramid is what I call training in cycles. And it's what Steven Seiler labels sport-specific and micro-periodization schemes. So what this refers to, so the last layer was macro periodization. That is like how you sequence your training types over the course of an entire training cycle. But there also need to be cycles within cycles. And the idea there is, I haven't said a word about recovery so far, right? Well, recovery matters a lot. I mentioned in discussing the previous slide that that your workload has to increase over time if you're going to get fitter, but your workload cannot increase every single week for the 12 to 16 weeks or whatever it is you spend preparing for a race without interruption, or you will overcook yourself. The body can only handle so much stress. Within the broader cycle of your training, you need these smaller cycles where you're balancing hard work and rest. So as your workload increases over time, it shouldn't be linear like this. It should look more like this squiggly thing you see on the slide here, where the overall trend is for your workload to go up, but it actually goes down at certain points. And those downswings are opportunities for your body to absorb the recent hard work you've done, process it, process fatigue, recover, and then emerge ready for even harder training. I refer to them as step cycles. A step cycle is typically a 3 to 4 week period. And let's just take an example of a 4-week step cycle. In week 1, you train hard. In week 2, you train a little harder. In week 3, you train a little harder still. And then in week 4, that's a recovery or regeneration week or a down week, where before you get to the breaking point, you plan a step back where you don't stop training, but you train less. And so it's just, by the end of, if in a 4-week step cycle, usually by the end of that 3rd week, you're feeling it. You're slogging a little bit, but don't worry, you've got a recovery week right around the corner where you cut back by 30% or whatever it is. And so you're still training, but by the time you get to the end of that week, because your workload has come down, you're starting to feel pretty fresh again. And then you're ready for another step cycle where, again, you take some 2 to 3 more steps up before you give yourself another chance to regenerate. So that's crucial. Just building in, it's what you don't want to do as a triathlete is rest only when an emergency happens. Like you train harder and harder and harder until your body says, red alert, we're about to fall apart, and then just take spontaneous recovery. There are times when you feel unexpectedly lousy and you do need to take a spontaneous day off, but it's actually best to plan those recovery periods so that they just happen on a schedule, and you get rest when you need it, and you get there are fewer of those times when you're surprised by how lousy you feel and have to take a spontaneous recovery day. So level 6 in the pyramid. So now we're getting pretty high up in the pyramid, close to the top. And again, the higher you get, these levels of the pyramid still have a positive impact on your training, but they don't have the same bang for the buck as the lower levels of the pyramid. So this one is what Steven Seiler refers to as training stimuli enhancement, examples being altitude, heat, and energy availability. I just refer to it as training in different conditions. There's a lot of attention to this realm these days. This is sort of like, I hate the word hacks, but this is sort of the hacks level of, getting the most out of your training. But there's some very effective methods that fall under this umbrella. 2 years ago, I actually spent an entire summer in Flagstaff, Arizona, training with a team of professional runners. And Flagstaff is 7,000 feet of elevation. That was the first time I'd ever trained at high altitude. And I felt that I got a ton out of it, actually. I was there for 13 weeks, which is just plenty of time to sort of ease into it and fully adapt. So that's one. The energy availability stuff is kind of cool. When I was training for Ironman Santa Rosa, which I did back in May, I worked with this company that does kind of fancy analysis of your training data and comes up with ideas. Well, they sort of assess your fitness with respect to your goals and then offer suggestions on ways you could get fitter. And, because I'm experienced and knowledgeable, they found the people who analyzed my data found that I was doing most things right already. But one thing they actually did suggest was this protocol for carbohydrate depleted workouts. So what they had me do is once a week, normally I have a fairly high carbohydrate diet, but once a week they had me do high intensity intervals on the bike in the late afternoon. And after those high intensity intervals on the bike, I would have a low carbohydrate dinner, which is not the norm for me. So that those high intensity intervals would deplete my muscles' glycogen stores. And then the low carbohydrate dinner would take care of my overall nutrition needs, but it would not replenish my glycogen stores. And then I would go to bed and sleep 8 hours. So, and when you sleep, your body is still actually burning glycogen. So by the time I got up in the morning, my muscles were severely glycogen depleted. I'd done a hard interval workout. I'd had a low carb dinner. I'd slept for 8 hours. And then I woke up in the morning and just did a 1 hour easy run. So you put those 4 steps together, and what it does is that that 1 hour easy run, it wasn't particularly challenging. I hated to do it on an empty stomach in a carb deprived state. But that protocol is actually proven in a study to provide physiological benefits, and particularly that increase your VO2 max that you can't get from normal training. So there's a lot of other stuff that you want to have in place before you try a highfalutin protocol like that. But in my case, I was already doing all of that lower hanging fruit. So I felt that I got some benefit out of it. Just once a week I did that. So that's an example of like these kind of hacks. Like when you've already got the lower levels of the pyramid covered, you can start to play around with ways of training in different conditions, either internal body conditions or external environmental conditions, to just eke out that last 2% that you're trying to get from your performance. But there's a lot of snake oil at this level too. People who are just promoting hacks that don't really have science behind them. So be careful if you're going to choose a method like this to try. Make sure it's got some a foundation of science. And then level 7 of the pyramid, the second to last level of the pyramid, is pacing training, or I label it train at race pace. So this is actually really crucial. Like you can train by the book and basically do everything right in your training and still have a lousy race because you execute poorly. I see it all the time, actually. I've been an athlete for so long that pacing is second nature for me. But there's a reason they call it performance, right? Like, just like an actor could know their lines and then get on stage and forget a line, like on race day, it's up to you. Like, nothing's guaranteed. You can be fit and ready, and you can still blow the whole thing by, the most common way of doing it is screwing up your pacing, starting off too fast or what have you. There are nutrition mistakes and other things too that also can spoil a race that ought to go well, but pacing is a huge one. And so especially, I believe in incorporating like little ways of getting better at pacing throughout the entire training cycle. But it becomes especially important in the final weeks when you're doing your most race specific workouts. You should set aside certain sessions that are actually intended to determine what your pacing plan will be for your race. Let's just say you're training for an Olympic distance triathlon. Well, what should your goal bike split be? You shouldn't just like guess, you should do workouts that target your hunch for how much power you can put out, or what, miles per hour or whatever. And then see if that seems realistic. And also what you do is, so you can fine tune your goal with those sessions, but you also get a sense of what it feels like to work that hard, which is crucial. Like, we have all these gadgets out there. We've got our power meters and heart rate monitors. Those things can't race for you. They can guide you to a certain degree, but ultimately the best racers get to the finish line in the least amount of time possible by feel. by relying on their own built-in subjective perception of effort. So you want to be very good at feeling your way to the fastest pace that you can sustain through a swim leg of whatever distance, a bike leg, and a run leg. And that takes experience. There's no shortcut. But building in like sort of, explicit opportunities to practice race pacing into your training is a crucial, it's a bridge between the meat of the training you've done and then executing on race day so that you don't waste all that fitness you've built up for yourself. And then the last step of the pyramid is the training taper. And I call it, don't blow it in the last week. So tapering is another one of these methods that has been intensively researched. And it's funny, like tapering, it's so intuitive now that you should rest up a bit before a race, right? Like even that, the top athletes from way back, 180 years ago, did not know. They didn't do it. They trained hard right up to race day. So even that had to be discovered. But now we know that you do need to lighten up your workload in order to race optimally. However, there's some fine print to it, because over resting is just as detrimental as under resting if you're tapering. So you don't want to just stop training for the last week, or even reduce your training too much. And it also, somewhat counterintuitively, you really want to keep some high intensity work into in your training, your taper period. And the reason is what's really going on in the taper is you're not just resting up for the race, you're also priming your body for racing. And you only get that priming effect if you continue to do some really hard work during the taper. People who fail to do that, they just reduce their training, they reduce both their volume and their intensity while tapering. It sends a message to your body on a kind of subconscious level that it's on vacation. And then when you actually get out there in a race, and a race is harder than any workout, it's sort of a shock to the system. If you've gone a week or 10 days without doing anything hard, your body's really not ready to do anything hard. So you just want to sprinkle in little doses of high intensity work within your taper period. So yes, the workload is coming down, but you're not just, resting on the sofa in the last week to 10 days. And also there's a tendency to make your taper too long. Honestly, like, think about it. Like when you're in training and you're in your absolute toughest week of training and you're taking on about as much as your body can handle. If you just lighten it up for 2 days and then do a tough workout, don't you usually feel great? Yeah, you do. So 2 days usually does it. And so you don't actually, the more you train at your peak level, the longer a taper you need. So if you're one of these professional triathletes who's training 30 hours a week at peak periods, yeah, you might need a 3-week taper, but the rest of us do not. So for a lot of people, like honestly, 3 or 4 days is plenty for something like a sprint or maybe even Olympic. A week is generous. And if you've been really getting after it in Ironman training, maybe 10 days will do the trick, up to 2 weeks. So that's another thing. So don't avoid the mistake. The most common mistakes people make with their taper are eliminating the high intensity stuff. You don't want to do that. And also simply tapering too long. So yeah, those two things should keep you from blowing it in the last week, as I say here. So this is my special bonus slide. This is so we've just gone over the 8 levels of Seiler's hierarchy of endurance training needs. Well, that's sort of, as I mentioned, this whole presentation has been a ripoff of Steven Seiler's work. Well, Seiler's hierarchy is also a ripoff of the work of a psychologist, a famous psychologist named Abraham Maslow. And he came up with what's known as the hierarchy of psychological needs for humans. And so this is his pyramid. So I wanted to give due credit to, as Seiler himself does, I also wanted to give credit to Abraham Maslow. This is also pretty interesting stuff if you want to delve into it, but it's off topic. Just thought I would close with that little nugget there. And then can I take some questions? I put in a slide inviting questions.
Yeah, I'm gonna unmute everybody and see if anybody has any questions.
Hi, Matt. This is Ime.
Hi there.
Good morning. I'm out in the Pacific Northwest, so it's still morning here.
Right on.
I have two questions that popped up. I'm holding your book, by the way, in my hand, so I was kind of following along some of the stuff that was in there with your presentation. Thank you so much. It's just backing up everything I was reading and trying to understand the last few years of my own triathlon training. So one thing out there is there's one of those hacks that you mentioned that people are starting to use, and I got introduced to it just a month ago. It's a little device you hold in your mouth called a GO2. Have you heard of it, and what do you think of it for people who need to train, but they're not in the right ideal environments to train for the race that they want to do, whether it's at elevation or it's more heat? What do you think of this little GO2 device, if you've heard of it?
No, I actually haven't, and this is the trouble. I should know everything, but I do tune out a lot of hacks.
It's fairly new.
Yeah, well, tell me about it.
So the person that originally put it in front of my nose is Angela Nath. She has been getting all of her I Race Like a Girl team members to consider trying it. And the first time I saw it was in a little video she shot of her in her house, in her little pain cave, riding on her indoor trainer with this device where you hold it in your mouth loosely, you put a seal around it with your lips, and then you basically just breathe through your mouth. So breathing out or breathing in isn't the problem, it's open. And then as you breathe out, a little flap that they made inside pushes outwards so that you can't exhale the way that you want to. You have to slow your exhale down, and that mimics what would happen at, say, elevation.
Oh,
it's harder to breathe out.
Okay.
And if you do that, starting with like a smaller session. So for example, if I have a 3-hour bike ride, I'm doing the first third of my training time. And sometimes I'll work it out as the easier part of the whole ride.
Yeah.
Just doing that, but still trying to maintain the same wattage, same speed and distance.
Yeah.
And just letting my body have some time to struggle a little bit.
Right.
And then I take it out and I ride the rest of my ride normal. Some people have been using this and training this way for a while. Angela Nath said she claimed that it helped her win the Little Debbie Ironman Chattanooga last year.
Yeah, two thoughts on that. Yeah, that's an intriguing concept that I'll definitely look into it. So two things. One is, it's a common misconception that training at altitude makes you fitter. It's actually living at altitude that makes you fitter. Training at altitude doesn't. So as long as you're at 7,000 feet or whatever, your blood is going to change in ways that help your sea level performance. And train, so, if all you ever, this is why, well, let me put it this way. You need about at least 10 hours a day, every day of exposure to high altitude to get and maintain these blood adaptations. And usually, you're only training 1 or 2 hours a day. So training ain't gonna do it. It's actually like sleeping, eating, watching TV. Like that's where the benefits occur. And training at high altitude itself is actually detrimental in the sense that you can't go as fast because you're not getting as much oxygen. So when I was training with this pro team in Flagstaff, we would, we did almost all of our training at high elevation, but we would actually go down the mountain to low elevation for key sessions so that we could go faster. So living in altitude definitely I had blood tests while I was there. It definitely changed my blood in beneficial ways. But all of the training I did, you know, I was doing only running there, but everything was about 18 seconds per mile slower than it would have been at sea level. Well, that's not going to do you any good, you know, if you're trying to hit a certain time in a marathon, which is what I was doing. So we would do our key sessions at about 3,000 feet. So there's that. So anything that actually simulated, you know, training at high elevation, I wouldn't put much stock in it offering any benefits. However, something completely different from training in an oxygen poor environment that has been shown to benefit performance is what's known as respiratory muscle training. And so there are other devices you can use. Actually, you can just take a straw. Breathing through a straw, you know, makes it harder to breathe. And there are things you can buy for respiratory muscle training, but that is actually, you're actually like strengthening your diaphragm muscles, you know, your breathing muscles through these techniques. And the thing is, if you just go out and train normally, yes, you know, you're using your breathing muscles, but it's actually your big, your larger prime movers that tire out first. So in most types of training, your respiratory muscles don't get as tired as, say, you know, your quads do. So respiratory muscle training is a way of flipping that around and stressing your breathing muscles to a degree that they don't usually get in training. And so that can have a beneficial effect. So that they're no longer sort of the weak link among your muscles. And it sounds to me like it's possible that this device you described to me could be beneficial for that. So I don't think it's going to change your blood parameters in ways that help you out, but it might be a form of respiratory muscle training that provides benefits. So I would need to know more, and I actually might be curious to try it myself. So it might be beneficial, but it would be in that specific way. Not that it changes your blood composition, but that it just strengthens your breathing muscles.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that answer. If nobody else has a question, I'll let them go first, but if you have more time for another question, I'll ask it later.
Okay.
Anybody else have questions?
I may have a question.
Great.
I have your book, Matt. Thank you so much for your presentation. I did lose power on my phone, so I apologize if my connection, I wasn't there for some of it. You may have mentioned this, but in your book, there's a chapter on distance-based and time-based workouts. Yep. What, I understand the distance, I mean the difference, but what do you recommend? Like I am a moderate athlete, I guess, over 60. Yep. What do you think is more beneficial for the general public as far as athletes?
I think most sessions should be time-based for a couple of reasons. One is that time-based workouts, you're less likely to go faster than you should. Like I'm talking about low intensity, like zone 2 types of sessions. Like if I tell you to go out and run 6 miles, a part of you is going to want to get those 6 miles over with. And the faster you run, the faster those 6 miles are going to be over with. If I tell you to go out and run for an hour is an hour. So there's that incentive to speed up and get it over with. It's useless because you're going to be out there an hour regardless. So for low intensity training, I think time-based workouts are useful in that regard. And then for high intensity workouts, time-based is really the way to go because that is, you know, it's, how do I say this? The benefits you get from training at higher intensity are associated with time exposure to that intensity, not distance exposure to that intensity. So for example, VO2 max intensity, which is, you know, the intensity at which you eventually are breathing as hard, your body is taking in as much oxygen as it possibly can. Whether you're just a beginner endurance athlete or you're an Olympic champion endurance athlete, you can hold your VO2 max intensity for about 8 minutes. Both of you, like, you know, the beginner and the elite can last about 8 minutes at their VO2 max intensity. The difference is the elite is going a lot faster for those 8 minutes, but you both have the same limit. So, you know, if that's why, you know, time-based intervals ensure that everyone across the spectrum of ability or fitness gets the appropriate dose of training. If you do it by time, athletes of different, I'm sorry, if you do it by distance, athletes of different abilities are going to get different amounts of exposure to that intensity, right? So say I gave you, like, you know, 6 times 2 minutes in zone 4. I'm sorry, try this again. Let's say it's a running session and it's 6 times 800 meters on a track. You know, an elite athlete, they're going to finish those 800 meters each in about 2.5 minutes. So they're going to get about 15 minutes of exposure to that intensity. An athlete with average talent is maybe going to spend 3 minutes and 45 seconds completing each 800 meters. And that adds up to a lot more exposure. So the same workout, if it's distance-based, is going to be way harder for a slower athlete than it is for a faster one. So it's 2 completely separate rationales that, you know, one applies more to low intensity sessions, the other applies more to high intensity sessions. But for those 2 reasons, I mean, you can translate from time to distance and distance to time, but you need to be sensitive to time for sure.
Okay. Well, thank you. Yeah. I never tried time-based, so.
Yeah. Again, you know, if you prefer, and in the pool, you have no choice, right? But as long as you're sensitive to how long it takes you to cover specific distances, then you can just make a conversion. But yeah, it's just important to know how much time am I spending at X, Y, or Z intensity, and is it appropriate, you know?
Right.
I
feel like when I am competing, I'm out there 6 hours. Well, everybody's done by 4 hours, you know, or about 5 hours. And I'm just out there so much longer, and it's more of an effort, I think. But I possibly should train more of a time-based.
Yeah. You know, actually, the one exception, partial exception, is if you're training for a very long distance event. I mean, you know, an Ironman bike leg is 112 miles for everyone, no matter how long it takes you to cover it. So you need to train to be able to cover that distance. And if it takes you longer, it takes you longer. So that is sort of the exception. Yeah, I mean, I'm training for an ultra marathon right now, and I did over the weekend, I did a 5-hour run. And, you know, I ran more than 37 miles in those 5 hours. And when I was out there, I was thinking, you know, there are a lot of 5-hour marathoners out there. And you know, I was ready to be done for the last, you know, hour and 15 minutes. And it gave me a respect. It is actually harder, you know, because you're just out there longer. And yeah, even psychologically, it's harder. And kind of, yeah, I get it.
It is. We know. We're out there.
Yep.
Don't forget us. We're coming.
Well, I'm on my way to joining. Like I'm 48 years old, so I'm not getting faster. I'm kind of going in the other direction. That's okay.
It's okay. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Anybody else before we wrap this up?
Did May want to ask her second question? I probably just massacred your name.
Yes, and I did have another question, and if you don't have time to answer it, I understand. You mentioned something about heart rate variability on page 28 in your book that I wanted to follow up with because it kind of went into your presentation. How can we, if you're going to use these kinds of tools, how can we use that data a bit better, especially with now Garmin, I noticed, will give you your heart rate variability stats per day. And I'm like, okay, this is interesting information, but I've never really used it to kind of tweak from day to day how I should adjust my training to make certain that my workouts weren't too stressful.
Yeah. You know, the short answer that I'll give you to hold you over for now is that those tools really only become useful when you personalize them to you. It's the same thing with like Training Peaks performance management chart that I mentioned earlier. Like the numbers are the numbers, but they don't actually mean anything until you are able to connect the numbers to their effects on your body. So like there are some athletes who, you know, when they're training when their whatever training stress balance is -3, they're a wreck. There are others when they're -3, they're fine. And so heart rate variability, what I would do is I would track the data and correlate it with subjective things, like just, you know, how you feel. Like, do you feel recovered? Do you feel sore? Do you feel fit? Do you feel fresh? And then you can start to notice patterns that will allow you to start using that data like sort of predictively and even prescriptively. But if I just told you like X number is good and Y number is bad, that may or may not apply to you. So that's the way to get started. You know, those tools can be useful, but the numbers are absolutes and they don't mean anything until you know what they mean for your body.
Great, thank you very much.
Sure.
All right, if nobody else has any questions, thank you very, very much, Matt, for your time. We all appreciate it. We're all reading your book and using your book. So it's very exciting that you're here, and we really do appreciate your time.
I enjoyed it, and thank you all for showing up.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a great day.
Yep, you too. Bye now.
Good luck on your ultra.
Thank you. I'm nervous.